The steam from the coffee machine hissed like an angry cat as Maya Chun balanced 3 plates on her left arm while reaching for the coffee pot with her right. Another double shift at Rosie's Roadhouse. Another day of being invisible to the truckers, college students, and business travelers who passed through this forgotten stretch of Interstate 40 just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. The morning sun filtered through windows that hadn't seen a proper cleaning in months, casting long shadows across the cracked vinyl booths and worn linoleum floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Maya had perfected the art of blending into the background. Her long black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, secured with whatever rubber bands she could find in the kitchen. Her uniform was the standard white, button-down shirt and black slacks that every server in America wore, complete with a small plastic name tag that simply read, Maya. Nothing about her appearance suggested that those same hands which now carried plates of eggs and bacon had once been trained to disable armed opponents in under 3 seconds. Maya wiped down the counter for the 4th time that morning, her movements automatic and efficient. She had learned to find purpose in repetition, to take pride in small things like perfectly aligned salt and pepper shakers or coffee that stayed hot throughout the breakfast rush. The other staff at Rosie's knew her as reliable, quiet, and completely unremarkable. She arrived early, worked without complaint, and never caused drama with customers or coworkers. What none of them knew was that Maya's quiet demeanor masked years of intensive training in multiple forms of combat, crisis management, and tactical response. Her steady hands had once diffused explosive devices in war zones, neutralized armed threats in hostile territories, and coordinated security operations for high-profile individuals whose safety determined the stability of nations. The calluses on her palms weren't from carrying heavy trays. They were from thousands of hours of hand-to-hand combat training, weapons practice, and tactical exercises that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The morning rush was typical for a Tuesday. Highway workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, a few early rising tourists heading toward the Grand Canyon, and the usual collection of locals who treated Rosie's as their unofficial community center. Maya moved between tables with fluid grace, refilling coffee cups and taking orders while mentally cataloging details that most people never noticed. The exit locations, the blind spots created by the restaurant's layout, the behavioral patterns of every customer, and the potential weapons available in any given situation. It was an old habit that she couldn't shake, this constant tactical awareness. Even in the safety of a small-town diner, Maya's mind automatically assessed threats, escape routes, and defensive positions. The training never really left you, no matter how many months you spent serving pancakes and taking orders from people who looked right through you as if you were part of the furniture. Detective Rick Patterson pushed through the front door at exactly 7:15, just like he had every morning for the past 6 months. He was a large man in his early 40s, with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through intimidation or authority. His uniform was always immaculate, his badge polished to a shine, and his voice carried the confident boom of someone who expected immediate compliance from everyone around him. "Coffee black," he announced without looking at Maya, settling into his usual booth near the back corner. "And make sure it's fresh this time." Yesterday's brew tasted like it had been sitting there since the Clinton administration. Maya nodded silently and poured his coffee, her brown eyes focused on the task while Detective Patterson launched into his morning routine of impressing whoever happened to be within earshot. Behind him, 2 other officers from the Flagstaff Police Department slid into the booth, their conversation immediately turning to war stories and complaints about departmental politics. "The problem with modern law enforcement," Detective Patterson was saying, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry across the entire dining room, is that civilians have no idea what real police work actually involves. They think it's all paperwork and traffic stops, when the reality is that we're the thin blue line between civilization and chaos. Officer Jennifer Walsh, a younger woman who seemed genuinely dedicated to public service, nodded respectfully while Officer Mike Torres appeared more interested in his menu than his superior's philosophical observations. Maya continued her rounds, refilling water glasses and clearing tables while Detective Patterson's monologue grew more grandiose with each passing minute. To the officers, Maya was simply part of the restaurant's atmosphere, no more notable than the coffee machine or the worn carpet. They discussed cases, procedures, and tactical situations with the casual assumption that civilians lacked the intelligence or training to understand the complexities of law enforcement. Maya had heard similar conversations countless times over. The past year, young officers discussing theoretical scenarios they hoped never to encounter. Experienced cops sharing stories of situations they'd handled with varying degrees of competence. Personal protection and threat assessment, Detective Patterson continued, warming to one of his favorite subjects, require instincts and training that ordinary people simply don't possess. The ability to read a situation, to identify potential threats, to respond with appropriate force when necessary. These are skills that take years to develop and can't be learned from watching television. He took a sip of coffee and made an exaggerated face of displeasure. This still tastes like dishwater, Maya, right? He snapped his fingers to get her attention, the sound sharp and dismissive. Could you possibly manage to brew coffee that doesn't taste like it was filtered through a gym sock? Maya replaced his cup with a fresh one, her expression neutral. I'll make a new pot, sir. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about, Detective Patterson said to his colleagues, not bothering to lower his voice. No problem-solving skills, no initiative. Just do what you're told and hope for the best. Can you imagine someone like this in a crisis situation? She'd probably faint at the first sign of actual danger. The casual cruelty in his voice made Officer Walsh shift uncomfortably in her seat, but military hierarchy and departmental politics prevented her from contradicting a superior officer. Maya continued her work with the same steady efficiency, clearing nearby tables while Detective Patterson entertained his audience with detailed explanations of why civilians were fundamentally incapable of understanding real security work. Take tactical response, for example, he said, gesturing broadly with his coffee cup. When armed suspects enter a location, trained officers have to assess the threat level, determine the best approach, coordinate with backup, and execute a response that neutralizes the danger while minimizing civilian casualties. It requires split-second decision-making under extreme pressure, the kind of training that takes years to master. Maya's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she wiped down a nearby table, but the movement was so subtle that none of the officers noticed. She had heard similar lectures dozens of times, law enforcement personnel discussing procedures and protocols that she had implemented in real-world situations where failure meant death for innocent people. The problem with civilian security, Detective Patterson continued, clearly enjoying his role as educator, is that it's mostly theater. Rent-a-cops and mall guards who think carrying a badge makes them qualified to handle real threats. In actual, dangerous situations, they're more likely to make things worse than better. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Around her neck, hidden beneath her uniform shirt, Maya wore a small silver pendant shaped like a phoenix. She touched it occasionally when she thought no one was looking, her thumb tracing the worn surface with the familiarity of long habit. It was the only visible reminder of a career that had officially never existed, accomplishments that had been classified beyond any level these officers would ever achieve. The pendant had been given to her by the director of a federal program. so classified that its existence was known only to a handful of people in Washington. It represented 5 years of the most dangerous undercover work imaginable, operations that had prevented terrorist attacks, neutralized international threats, and saved thousands of lives through actions that could never be publicly acknowledged. Maya Chun had once been Special Agent Chun, a member of an elite federal task force that specialized in high-risk infiltration and threat neutralization. She had posed as everything from a corporate executive to a college student, gathering intelligence and eliminating dangers that conventional law enforcement couldn't even identify. Her training had included advanced combat techniques from multiple martial arts disciplines, weapons expertise that covered everything from improvised explosives to sniper rifles, and psychological conditioning that allowed her to maintain deep cover for months at a time. But Maya Chen, the federal agent, had officially died in a classified operation 2 years ago. The woman serving coffee at Rosie's Roadhouse was just another face in the crowd, working a dead-end job in a small town, where nobody asked uncomfortable questions about your past or why you might prefer to stay invisible. Detective Patterson finished his breakfast and left without leaving a tip, making one final comment about civilian incompetence as he walked toward his patrol car. Maya watched him go through the window, then began clearing his table with the same methodical care she applied to every aspect of her current life. Through the glass, she could see the officers clustered around Patterson's tablet, examining what appeared to be crime scene photos and case files. Their animated discussion was clearly visible, even from inside the restaurant, their gestures indicating they were reviewing tactical procedures and discussing response protocols for various scenarios. Maya knew those procedures. She had developed some of them during her years with the Federal Task Force, created training protocols that were now standard practice in law enforcement agencies across the country. But Maya Chen, the waitress, wasn't supposed to know anything about advanced tactical response or threat assessment. As she loaded dishes into the industrial dishwasher, Maya allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Let them discuss theoretical scenarios and tactical procedures they'd learned in training academies. Let them debate the qualifications required for situations they hoped never to encounter in real life. Soon enough, circumstances would arise that would remind everyone why certain skills never fade, even when the people who possess them choose to remain hidden. The question wasn't whether these confident officers would discover who was serving their coffee. The question was whether they would be ready for the truth when reality delivered it in a way that would challenge everything they thought they knew about capability, training, and the extraordinary people who sometimes hide in the most ordinary places. Maya had spent 2 years perfecting her invisible routine, serving coffee to people who made assumptions about her intelligence, her background, and her capabilities based on nothing more than her job title and quiet demeanor. She had endured countless lectures about subjects she understood better than the people explaining them, tolerated condescending remarks about civilian incompetence, and smiled politely while listening to tactical theories from officers whose most dangerous encounter had been a traffic stop that got slightly heated. But Maya understood something that Detective Patterson and his colleagues had never learned. Sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one that nobody notices. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from allowing others to underestimate you completely. And sometimes the quiet person refilling your coffee has forgotten more about threat response than you'll learn in your entire career. The training never really left you. Even after 2 years of serving pancakes and enduring condescending lectures from small-town cops, Maya's mind still automatically cataloged tactical information whenever she was in public spaces. She noted the location of every exit, identified potential cover positions, assessed the threat level of every person who walked through the door, and maintained constant awareness of anything that could be used as a weapon if the situation demanded it. It was exhausting, this perpetual vigilance that served no purpose in her current life. But it was also comforting in a strange way. like keeping a skill sharp even when you hoped never to need it again. Maya had seen enough of the world's dangers to know that threats could emerge from anywhere, at any time, in ways that nobody anticipated. The morning crowd began to thin out as people headed to work or continued their journeys along the interstate. Maya switched from breakfast service to the slower pace of mid-morning coffee refills and pie service, her routine shifting seamlessly from one phase to another. She cleaned the coffee machines, restocked the napkin dispensers, and prepared for the lunch crowd that would arrive in a few hours. Regular customers knew her as reliable and friendly, someone who remembered their usual orders and never made small talk unless they initiated it first. The local sheriff's deputies trusted her to hold their table when they were called away on emergency calls, knowing their coffee would still be hot when they returned. Truckers appreciated that she never rushed them through their meals, understanding that a hot meal and clean restroom might be the only comforts they'd have for the next several hundred miles. But none of them really saw her, not in any meaningful way. Maya had become part of the background, a fixture of the restaurant that performed necessary functions without drawing attention to herself. It was exactly what she had intended when she'd chosen this new life, this deliberate invisibility that allowed her to heal from years of living on the edge of disaster. The federal task force had burned her out in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. 5 years of assuming false identities, of never knowing whether the person sitting next to you was friend or enemy, of making split-second decisions that could save or cost innocent lives, had left her emotionally drained and psychologically fragmented. She had requested extraction from deep cover work after a particularly brutal assignment in Eastern Europe, an operation that had required her to maintain a false identity for 8 months while gathering intelligence on an arms trafficking network. The assignment had been successful. The intelligence she'd gathered had led to the arrests of dozens of criminals and prevented weapons from reaching terrorist organizations across 3 continents. But the personal cost had been enormous, requiring her to become someone else, so completely that she'd almost forgotten who she really was underneath the layers of deception and carefully constructed lies. Maya Chun, the federal agent, had officially died in a warehouse fire in Prague. The death had been staged with enough supporting evidence to satisfy any investigation, complete with dental records and DNA samples that confirmed her demise. It was a standard procedure for agents who needed to disappear completely, either for their own protection or because their cover had been blown in ways that made continued service impossible. Maya Chun, the waitress, had been born in the ashes of that staged death. She'd spent 6 months in a federal safe house, working with psychologists and counselors to rebuild her identity from the ground up. The process had been both therapeutic and terrifying, learning to be a real person again after years of being whoever the mission required her to be. The choice to work in a small-town diner hadn't been random. Maya had wanted the exact opposite of her previous life: routine instead of chaos, genuine interactions instead of calculated deceptions, and the simple satisfaction of work that helped people in straightforward, uncomplicated ways. Serving coffee and taking orders was honest work that required no lies, no hidden agendas, and no life-or-death decisions. For 2 years, it had worked perfectly. Maya had found peace in the rhythm of restaurant service, healing in the simple pleasure of making good food and providing friendly service to people who were just trying to get through their day. She'd rented a small apartment above the town's used bookstore, adopted a cat named Phoenix, and built a quiet life that asked nothing more of her than showing up on time and doing her job well. But the skills remained, buried beneath layers of deliberate normalcy like weapons in a forgotten cache. Muscle memory that could disarm an attacker faster than conscious thought, tactical awareness that never fully shut down, and combat instincts that years of peaceful routine couldn't completely erase. Maya told herself that part of her life was over, that she'd found a better way to exist in the world. She almost believed it, most days. The lunch crowd brought the usual mix of highway workers, local business people, and travelers stopping for food and fuel. Maya moved through her service routine with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering meals while maintaining the pleasant but unremarkable demeanor that had become second nature. Detective Patterson returned for lunch, bringing two colleagues Maya hadn't seen before. One was an older man with sergeant stripes who carried himself with the weary competence of someone who'd seen enough of human nature to maintain realistic expectations. The other was a young officer who looked fresh out of the academy, eager and nervous in the way that suggested this was still an adventure rather than a job. "Maya, right," Detective Patterson called out as she approached their table. "We're going to need the back booth for a private discussion. Police business, you understand. Confidential matters that require discretion." Maya nodded and directed them to the corner booth that offered the most privacy, then began the process of serving their lunch while they spread case files and photographs across the table. From her position at nearby tables, she could overhear enough of their conversation to understand. They were discussing a series of armed robberies that had been occurring throughout northern Arizona. 3 incidents in the past month, the sergeant was saying, his voice low but not quite quiet enough to prevent eavesdropping. Different locations, but the same pattern. 2 or 3 suspects, armed with automatic weapons, in and out fast, with maximum intimidation. The young officer leaned forward eagerly, clearly hoping to demonstrate his analytical capabilities. "Sir, have we identified any connections between the target locations? Similar cash flows, security vulnerabilities, or geographic patterns that might help us predict the next strike?" Detective Patterson's response carried the patronizing tone of someone educating a subordinate. "Robbery crews like this don't usually target specific types of businesses, rookie. They're opportunists who hit whatever looks easy and profitable. Gas stations, convenience stores, small restaurants like this one, places with minimal security and maximum cash on hand." Maya's hand tightened imperceptibly on the coffee pot she was holding, but she continued her serving routine without visible reaction. The conversation was moving into territory that triggered all her old instincts, professional awareness that she'd spent 2 years trying to suppress. "The concerning factor," the sergeant continued, "is the level of firepower they're bringing to relatively low-value targets. Automatic weapons, body armor, flashbang grenades. This isn't your typical smash-and-grab operation. These suspects are equipped for warfare." Through her peripheral vision, Maya could see crime scene photographs scattered across their table. The images showed the aftermath of violent encounters, broken glass and damaged property that spoke of overwhelming force applied to soft targets. The suspects were clearly professionals, using military-grade equipment and tactics against civilian businesses that had no capacity for serious resistance. Detective Patterson gestured broadly with his fork, speaking around a mouthful of sandwich. "The key to stopping crews like this is superior firepower and tactical coordination. When they hit their next target, we need to respond with overwhelming force. Show them that they're not the only ones who can escalate a situation." Maya felt her jaw tighten at the tactical ignorance embedded in that statement. Escalation was exactly the wrong response to professional robbery crews, a guaranteed method for turning property crime into mass casualty events. But Maya Chen, the waitress, had no standing to offer corrections to law enforcement professionals discussing their cases. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering response protocols, backup procedures, and coordination with federal agencies. Maya listened while clearing tables and refilling coffee cups, her trained mind automatically identifying the weaknesses in their approach and the assumptions that could prove fatal if the situation developed as they expected. When the officers finally left, gathering their case files and heading back to whatever passed for tactical planning in the Flagstaff Police Department, Maya began cleaning their table with unusual thoroughness. She'd heard enough to understand that professional criminals were operating in her area, using methods and equipment that local law enforcement was poorly equipped to handle. For the first time in 2 years, Maya found herself thinking tactically again, not as a curious observer, but as someone who might need to respond if circumstances demanded it. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting, like discovering that an old friend was still alive after years of believing them dead. Maya finished her shift at 3 o'clock, walking home through downtown Flagstaff while her mind processed the information she'd overheard. Professional robbery crews didn't usually operate in small towns unless they were either desperate or following intelligence about specific high-value targets. The fact that they were using military-grade equipment suggested either extensive criminal connections or backgrounds in armed forces. Either way, they represented exactly the kind of threat that local law enforcement was unprepared to handle. Detective Patterson's cowboy approach to tactical response would likely result in civilian casualties if the situation escalated beyond simple property crime. Maya had seen similar scenarios play out in her federal work, watched well-meaning, but poorly trained officers turn manageable situations into disasters through tactical incompetence. She climbed the stairs to her apartment above Murphy's used books, unlocking the door to reveal the simple but comfortable space she'd created for her new life. Phoenix, her orange tabby cat, greeted her with the demanding affection of a creature whose schedule revolved entirely around mealtimes and attention. Maya fed the cat and made herself a simple dinner, trying to focus on the domestic routine that had brought her so much peace over the past 2 years. But her mind kept returning to the conversation she'd overheard, the tactical problems embedded in the police response plan, and the growing certainty that the robbery crew would strike again soon. She told herself it wasn't her problem anymore. Maya Chun, the federal agent, was dead and buried beneath layers of paperwork and official records. Maya Chun, the waitress, had no responsibility beyond showing up for her next shift and serving coffee to whoever walked through the door. But as she sat in her quiet apartment, listening to the distant sound of highway traffic and watching Phoenix clean himself with single-minded determination, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that her 2 years of peaceful anonymity were about to come to an abrupt and violent end. Because some skills never fade, no matter how deeply you bury them. Some instincts never die, no matter how long you try to ignore them. And sometimes the world has a way of finding the people it needs, even when those people have worked very hard to make themselves impossible to find. The storm Detective Patterson was creating with his tactical ignorance was about to encounter a force of nature he couldn't possibly comprehend. And when that collision finally occurred, the small town cop would discover that some people's true capabilities remain hidden until the moment when revealing them becomes the only way to save innocent lives. Maya touched the phoenix pendant beneath her shirt, feeling the familiar weight of metal that represented everything she'd tried to leave behind. Tomorrow she would return to Rosie's roadhouse, pour coffee for people who looked right through her, and continue the quiet life she'd built from the ashes of her former existence. Unless, of course, professional criminals decided to test their skills against a target that looked soft and defenseless but was actually protected by someone whose forgotten accomplishments exceeded their most ambitious criminal aspirations. The question wasn't whether Maya Chun could return to her old life when circumstances demanded it. The question was whether Detective Patterson and his colleagues would be ready for the truth when it materialized in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about capability, training, and the extraordinary people who sometimes hide in the most ordinary places. Maya fell asleep that night with Phoenix curled against her side, the cats purring a comforting counterpoint to the distant sound of traffic on Interstate 40. But her dreams were filled with tactical scenarios and threat assessments, the old patterns reasserting themselves as her subconscious mind prepared for possibilities that her conscious mind was still trying to deny. Because some storms arrive from directions you never see coming, carried by people who prefer to remain invisible until the moment when visibility becomes the only way to protect everything you've come to care about. The systematic humiliation began 3 days after Maya overheard the robbery crew discussion. Detective Patterson had apparently decided that Rosie's Roadhouse would serve as his unofficial headquarters for case planning, giving him a captive audience for demonstrations of his superior knowledge and authority. He arrived each morning with increasing arrogance, treating Maya's quiet competence as evidence of intellectual inferiority that needed constant correction. "Maya, sweetheart," Detective Patterson called out during the Thursday morning rush, his voice carrying across the entire restaurant with deliberate volume. "We're going to need faster service today. Real law enforcement professionals have important work to discuss, not like civilians who've never faced actual responsibility." Maya nodded silently and increased her pace, refilling coffee cups and clearing tables while Detective Patterson continued his performance for the benefit of his assembled colleagues. Officer Walsh looked uncomfortable with her superior's behavior, but departmental hierarchy prevented her from intervening as the verbal attacks escalated with each passing day. "You know what I bet?" Detective Patterson announced to Officer Torres while Maya wiped down a nearby table. "I bet our waitress here thinks police work is just like those crime shows on television. Probably thinks real tactical situations are solved in 60 minutes with commercial breaks." The cruel laughter that followed made Maya's jaw tighten imperceptibly, but she maintained her neutral expression while continuing her methodical cleaning routine. She had endured worse treatment during undercover assignments in hostile territories, survived interrogations that would have broken most people, and maintained operational security under circumstances that these officers couldn't begin to imagine. But this was different. This wasn't enemy action or professional necessity. This was petty cruelty from people who should have known better. People who wore badges that were supposed to represent service and protection rather than bullying and intimidation. "Maya," Detective Patterson called out again, snapping his fingers like he was summoning a dog. "Since you're obviously fascinated by our conversations about law enforcement, maybe you'd like to share your expert opinion on tactical response procedures." The question was delivered with such dripping sarcasm that other customers in the restaurant turned to watch what was clearly intended as public entertainment at Maya's expense. Detective Patterson was performing for an audience, demonstrating his superiority over someone he considered beneath his notice. Maya approached the table with her coffee pot, her expression carefully neutral. "I don't know anything about police work, sir. I just serve coffee." "Of course you don't," Detective Patterson replied with exaggerated sympathy. "But I'm sure you have opinions. Civilians always have opinions about things they don't understand. Please enlighten us about your theories on threat assessment and crisis management." The other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sergeant Williams looked like he wanted to intervene, but military hierarchy and departmental politics prevented subordinates from correcting their superiors, even when those superiors were behaving like schoolyard bullies. Maya refilled Detective Patterson's cup with steady hands. "I wouldn't presume to have opinions about subjects beyond my experience." "How refreshingly honest," Detective Patterson said, his voice dripping with false praise. "At least you recognize your limitations, unlike some people who think watching police procedurals makes them qualified to discuss advanced tactical operations." Over the following days, the verbal abuse became routine. Detective Patterson would arrive each morning with new ways to demonstrate Maya's supposed ignorance, new opportunities to showcase his own superior knowledge to whoever happened to be listening. The restaurant became his personal stage for lectures about civilian incompetence and professional superiority. "Our waitress probably thinks tactical response means calling 911 and hiding under a table," Detective Patterson announced during one particularly cruel session. "She probably imagines that real police work involves asking nicely for criminals to surrender their weapons and explain their motivations." Maya continued serving breakfast while enduring detailed explanations of why civilians couldn't possibly understand the complexities of law enforcement, why advanced tactical procedures required intellectual capabilities that ordinary people simply didn't possess, and why professional threat assessment was beyond the comprehension of anyone who hadn't attended a police academy. The attacks weren't limited to professional knowledge. Detective Patterson found endless opportunities to mock Maya's appearance, her educational background, her career choices, and her general fitness for any role more demanding than serving coffee to her intellectual superiors. "Look at her hands," Detective Patterson observed loudly during one particularly painful morning. "Soft civilian hands that have never done anything more demanding than carrying plates. Can you imagine hands like that trying to handle a firearm under pressure? She'd probably drop the weapon and run at the first sign of actual danger." Maya's hands, which had in fact handled everything from sniper rifles to improvised explosive devices under combat conditions, remained steady as she cleared away empty plates. Those same fingers had disarmed dozens of armed suspects, performed emergency medical procedures under fire, and executed precision movements that had saved countless lives in situations these officers would never encounter. The psychological warfare escalated when Detective Patterson began bringing printed materials to support his educational efforts. He would spread tactical manuals and case studies across his table, loudly explaining basic law enforcement concepts ostensibly for Maya's benefit, but clearly intended to demonstrate the vast intellectual gap between trained professionals and ignorant civilians. "These are called threat assessment protocols," Detective Patterson would announce, pointing to flowcharts with exaggerated patience. "They're the procedures that real officers use to evaluate dangerous situations. I don't expect you to understand the complexity involved, but maybe you can at least memorize the terminology." Maya would nod politely and continue working while enduring lectures about criminal psychology, tactical positioning, firearms proficiency, and crisis negotiation. Information she had mastered at theoretical and practical levels before these officers were sworn in, applied in real-world situations that remained classified beyond their security clearances. The cruelest moment came when Detective Patterson discovered Maya's Phoenix pendant during a particularly busy lunch rush. Maya had been leaning across a table to clear dishes when the chain slipped out from beneath her uniform collar, revealing the small silver symbol for just a moment before she could tuck it back out of sight. "Well, well," Detective Patterson said with malicious delight. "Our little waitress has symbolic jewelry. Let me guess, you bought that at some New Age shop, trying to pretend you have some kind of spiritual connection to power and transformation." Maya's face remained impassive, but her hand unconsciously moved to cover the pendant through her shirt. That piece of silver represented achievements that exceeded anything in Detective Patterson's service record, awarded only to federal agents who had completed operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. It symbolized rebirth through fire, transformation through trial, and survival through circumstances that would have destroyed ordinary people. "It's probably from some motivational seminar," Detective Patterson continued, encouraged by Maya's silence. "Civilian self-help enthusiasts love to wear symbolic accessories. Makes them feel connected to concepts they could never actually embody." The humiliation reached its peak when Detective Patterson began bringing junior officers specifically to witness his educational sessions with the ignorant waitress. He would schedule briefings during Maya's shifts, ensuring maximum audience for his demonstrations of intellectual superiority. "Watch this," Detective Patterson would tell his subordinates. "I'm going to explain basic threat recognition to our civilian friend here. Notice how she nods and pretends to understand, even though the concepts are completely beyond her comprehension." Maya endured detailed explanations of criminal behavior patterns, tactical communication systems, weapons handling procedures, and emergency response protocols. Techniques she had developed, improved, and implemented in environments where theoretical Knowledge wasn't sufficient for survival. But Maya Chen, the waitress, wasn't supposed to know any of this. So she listened politely, nodded at appropriate intervals, and continued serving coffee to people who had no idea. They were humiliating someone whose forgotten accomplishments exceeded their most ambitious career goals. Each morning brought fresh cruelty, new opportunities for Detective Patterson to demonstrate his superiority over someone he considered intellectually inferior. Maya absorbed it all with the stoic endurance she had learned during resistance training, during psychological conditioning exercises, during missions where maintaining cover was more important than personal dignity. The breaking point came on. A gray Wednesday morning when Detective Patterson decided to elevate his cruelty to a new level. He had brought a rookie officer fresh from the academy, a young woman named Rebecca Santos who reminded Maya painfully of herself at that age. Eager, competent, and completely unprepared for the institutional bullying that some departments considered normal. "Santos, you need to understand something about civilian psychology," Detective Patterson was saying, his voice loud enough to ensure Maya could hear every word. Most people live in a fantasy world where they imagine themselves capable of handling dangerous situations. They watch action movies and think that courage is something you can just decide to have when the moment comes. Officer Santos looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but she listened respectfully while Detective Patterson continued his lecture, using Maya as a visual aid for civilian incompetence. "Take our waitress, for example," Detective Patterson said, gesturing toward Maya as she cleaned nearby tables. "I guarantee you she's imagined herself in heroic scenarios. Probably fantasized about being the brave citizen who saves the day when criminals threaten innocent people. But look at her. Does she look like someone who could handle actual violence? Could those soft hands deal with armed suspects? Would that gentle demeanor hold up under real pressure?" Maya's cleaning cloth paused for just a moment, but she continued her routine while Detective Patterson escalated his psychological assault. "The truth is, Santos, that civilians have no concept of what real violence looks like. They've never faced someone who wants to kill them, never made split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance, never experienced the kind of fear that turns your blood to ice and makes your hands shake so badly you can't even dial a phone." Officer Santos was looking increasingly uncomfortable, but Detective Patterson was enjoying his performance too much to notice his subordinate's distress. "Maya, come over here for a minute," Detective Patterson called out. "I want to use you for a demonstration about civilian threat assessment." Maya approached the table with her coffee pot, her expression carefully neutral despite the rage building behind her calm facade. "Now, Santos, I want you to observe our waitress carefully," Detective Patterson said, treating Maya like an inanimate object rather than a human being. "Notice the body language, the soft posture, the complete lack of situational awareness. This is what untrained civilians look like when they think they're safe." He turned to Maya with condescending smile. "Maya, I want you to imagine a scenario for us. Let's say 3 armed men walk through that door right now, carrying automatic weapons and demanding money. What would you do? How would our brave civilian hero handle that situation?" Maya's hand tightened on the coffee pot, but her voice remained steady. "I would do whatever they asked and hope nobody got hurt." "Exactly," Detective Patterson exclaimed triumphantly. "Submit and pray. That's the civilian response to real danger. No training, no tactics, no capability beyond hoping that someone else will save them." He was warming to his theme now, using Maya's enforced passivity as evidence for his theories about civilian incompetence. "You see, Santos, this is why professional law enforcement is so critical. When armed criminals threaten innocent people, civilians like Maya become helpless victims who need real professionals to protect them. They simply don't have the training, the courage, or the capability to protect themselves, much less other people." Maya felt something cold and dangerous stirring in her chest, the old instincts responding to threat and humiliation in ways she'd spent 2 years trying to suppress. Detective Patterson had crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed, using her as a prop for his ego while demonstrating everything wrong with modern law enforcement attitudes. Maya, since you're so fascinated by police work, Detective Patterson continued, maybe you'd like to share your thoughts on how officers should respond to armed robbery situations. Give us your civilian perspective on tactical procedures. The question was delivered with such obvious mockery that even other customers were beginning to look uncomfortable. Detective Patterson had created a public spectacle designed to humiliate Maya for his own entertainment, crossing boundaries of basic human decency in service of his pathological need to demonstrate superiority. Maya set down the coffee pot and looked directly at Detective Patterson for the first time since he'd begun his systematic campaign of psychological warfare. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of authority that made everyone at the table stop breathing. Detective Patterson, there are 3 things you should know about armed robbery response, Maya said quietly, her tone shifting from subservient to professional in a way that sent chills down Officer Santos's spine. First, escalation protocols that prioritize officer ego over civilian safety result in unnecessary casualties. Second, tactical assumptions based on prejudice rather than training get people killed. And third, sometimes the person you're underestimating knows more about the subject than you'll learn in your entire career. The silence that followed was deafening. Detective Patterson stared at Maya with complete incomprehension, his brain struggling to process the transformation he'd just witnessed. Officer Santos felt pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly clicking into place, remembering small details about Maya's behavior that now took on entirely different significance. Maya reached beneath her uniform shirt and pulled out the Phoenix pendant that Detective Patterson had mocked so cruelly. But this time she held it, where everyone could see the intricate details that identified it as something far more significant than New Age jewelry. My name is Special Agent Maya Chun, she continued, her posture straightening into bearing that radiated competence and authority. Federal Task Force Designation Phoenix 7, and I've neutralized more armed robbery crews than you've written. Traffic tickets. The revelation hit the assembled officers like a physical blow, but Maya wasn't finished. The systematic humiliation had pushed her past the point where maintaining cover was possible, and once that line was crossed, there was no reason to hold back any longer. Detective Patterson, you've spent weeks lecturing me about tactical procedures that I helped develop, crisis management techniques that I've applied in real-world situations, and threat assessment protocols that I created for federal training programs. You've used me as an example of civilian incompetence while discussing subjects that I understand better than you ever will. Detective Patterson's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Officer Santos was staring at Maya with something approaching awe, finally understanding why something about the quiet waitress had always seemed slightly off. Special Agent Chun, Officer Santos said quietly, if you're really federal law enforcement, why are you working in a restaurant? What are you doing here? Maya's smile was cold and professional, the expression of someone who had maintained deep cover assignments under conditions these officers couldn't imagine. Officer Santos, some federal operations require complete integration into civilian populations. When you're hunting threats that conventional law enforcement can't identify, sometimes the best cover is perfect invisibility. She turned back to Detective Patterson, who was still struggling to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew. Detective, the armed robbery crew you've been investigating represents a level of professional capability that your department is completely unprepared to handle. Your escalation-focused response plan will result in civilian casualties and officer deaths when they make their next move. Maya's transformation was complete now, the humble waitress replaced by someone who commanded rooms through competence rather than authority. Her voice carried the calm precision of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. "Agent Chun," Sergeant Williams said, finally finding his voice, "what kind of threats are we actually facing? What do you know about this robbery crew that we don't?" Maya's expression became grimly professional as she shifted into briefing mode, her civilian disguise completely abandoned in favor of the tactical precision that had made her legendary in federal circles. "Sergeant, you're facing a three-person team with military backgrounds, using weapons and tactics that exceed conventional law enforcement capabilities. They're not opportunistic criminals. They're professionals following intelligence about specific high-value targets." Officer Santos leaned forward with urgent questions. "Agent Chun, if you've been monitoring this situation, why haven't you intervened? Why maintain cover when you could have been helping us prepare for this threat?" Maya's response carried the patience of someone explaining complex operational requirements to people who lack the necessary security clearances. "Officer Santos, Federal Task Force operations require absolute compartmentalization. My mission was to identify and assess threats while maintaining complete operational invisibility. Revealing my presence would have compromised ongoing investigations that extend far beyond your local jurisdiction." Detective Patterson, who had spent weeks demonstrating Maya's supposed ignorance, finally managed to speak through his shock and embarrassment. "Agent Chun, I had no idea. The things I said, the way I treated you. I was completely wrong about everything." Maya's expression showed the professional restraint of someone who had endured far worse treatment during undercover assignments. Detective Patterson, assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence are dangerous in any profession, but particularly in law enforcement, where those assumptions can get innocent people killed. She moved toward the restaurant's front window, her trained eyes scanning the parking lot and surrounding area, with the systematic awareness of someone expecting trouble. "The conversation you had yesterday about response protocols has been monitored by parties with interests in this operation. Your tactical planning session may have accelerated their timeline for the next target." Sergeant Williams felt his blood run cold. "Agent Chun, are you saying they know about our investigation? That they might be planning to hit a target before we can respond?" Maya's smile was sharp and professional, carrying the confidence of someone who had faced similar situations before and survived through superior preparation rather than luck. "Sergeant, professional robbery crews don't operate in small towns unless they're following specific intelligence about high-value opportunities. The fact that they're using military-grade equipment suggests they're planning something significantly more ambitious than convenience store robberies." She turned back to face the assembled officers, her transformation from invisible waitress to federal agent now complete. "And based on the tactical patterns I've observed, combined with the intelligence gathering they've been conducting in this area, I believe their next target is going to be Rosie's Roadhouse during tonight's dinner rush." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Officer Santos stared at Maya with growing comprehension. Detective Patterson experienced the impossible sensation of having his entire worldview shattered in a matter of minutes, and Sergeant Williams began calculating response options for a scenario that exceeded his department's capabilities. Maya reached for the secure phone that she'd kept hidden in her uniform pocket for 2 years, the encrypted device that connected her directly to federal resources that local law enforcement couldn't access. "This is Phoenix 7 requesting immediate tactical support," Maya said into the phone, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded resources that Detective Patterson couldn't imagine. "We have a confirmed threat against civilian targets with imminent timeline. I need a full response package deployed to my location within 6 hours." As Maya coordinated federal backup for the crisis that was about to unfold, Detective Patterson sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that the woman he'd spent weeks humiliating possessed capabilities that exceeded his wildest professional aspirations. The quiet waitress who'd served his coffee with patient dignity was about to remind everyone why certain legends were whispered about in federal law enforcement circles. The storm was finally breaking, and it would arrive in the form of someone who had spent 2 years allowing others to underestimate her completely. Someone who understood that the greatest strength sometimes comes from perfect invisibility, and that the most dangerous opponents are the ones nobody sees coming until it's far too late to prepare for what they're capable of delivering. Maya Chun, the waitress, was gone forever. In her place stood Special Agent Chun, preparing to engage threats that would challenge everything these small-town officers thought they knew about capability, training, and the extraordinary people who sometimes hide in the most ordinary places. The question was no longer whether Maya could handle the situation that was developing. The question was whether Detective Patterson and his colleagues would be ready for the truth about what real tactical competence looked like when it emerged from the shadows where it had been hiding for 2 years. Because some storms arrive from directions you never anticipate, carried by people who prefer to remain invisible until the moment when visibility becomes the only way to protect innocent lives from threats that conventional law enforcement isn't equipped to handle. The federal response team arrived in unmarked vehicles exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes after Maya's call, their timing precise enough to suggest they had been positioned nearby for exactly this type of emergency. Agent Rodriguez, the team leader, entered Rosie's roadhouse through the kitchen entrance while his tactical specialists began establishing surveillance positions around the building's perimeter. Maya had spent the afternoon transforming the restaurant into a defensive position, her movements efficient and purposeful as she identified cover points, secured potential weapons, and established sight lines that would give her maximum advantage when the confrontation began. The dinner rush was proceeding normally, regular customers unaware that they were sitting in what would soon become an active combat zone. Detective Patterson watched Maya's preparations with fascination and growing respect, finally understanding that he was witnessing expertise that exceeded anything in his professional experience. Every movement she made served multiple tactical purposes, creating overlapping fields of fire while maintaining the restaurant's normal appearance to casual observation. Agent Chun, what's our timeline? Agent Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone who had coordinated similar operations across multiple jurisdictions. Maya glanced at the wall clock, then at the parking lot where evening traffic was beginning to increase as people stopped for dinner during their commutes home from work. Based on their previous operational patterns, they'll move during peak business hours when maximum cash is available and multiple escape routes remain viable. I estimate we have between 45 minutes and 2 hours before they make their approach. Officer Santos, who had remained at the restaurant to assist with civilian coordination, raised a concern that had been troubling her since Maya's revelation. Agent Chun, shouldn't we evacuate the customers? If armed suspects are planning to rob this place, we're putting innocent people at risk by allowing normal business to continue. Maya's response demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that separated federal operatives from conventional law enforcement. Officer Santos, evacuating the restaurant would alert the suspects that their operation has been compromised. They would either abort and select a different target, or accelerate their timeline and attack while we're still repositioning resources. Either scenario results in fewer options for containing the threat. Agent Rodriguez nodded his agreement, while checking the tactical display on his tablet computer. Agent Chun is correct. Professional robbery crews conduct extensive surveillance before committing to a target. Any deviation from normal patterns would trigger contingency protocols that make the situation significantly more dangerous. Sergeant Williams, who had arrived to coordinate local law enforcement support, struggled with the ethical implications of using civilians as unknowing participants in a tactical operation. Agent Chun, I understand the strategic reasoning, But these people didn't consent to become part of a federal law enforcement operation. We're making decisions about their safety without their knowledge. Maya's expression showed the weight of someone who had made similar decisions dozens of times during her federal career, balancing competing priorities in situations where perfect solutions didn't exist. Sergeant Williams, the suspects have already made this decision for us. When professional criminals target civilian locations, everyone present becomes part of the operational environment, whether they consent or not. Our responsibility is to minimize casualties while neutralizing the threat. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by Agent Martinez, the surveillance specialist, who reported movement in the parking lot that matched the behavioral patterns Maya had described. Agent Chun, we have 3 subjects approaching in a dark sedan, license plate obscured, occupants wearing clothing consistent with tactical gear. They're conducting a reconnaissance pass before committing to entry. Maya moved to the front window, her trained eyes identifying details that ordinary observers would miss. The vehicle's occupants were scanning the restaurant's interior through tinted windows, counting customers and assessing resistance potential with the systematic thoroughness of people who had done this many times before. 2 minutes until they park and begin final approach, Maya said, her voice shifting into the calm precision that characterized federal agents under pressure. Agent Rodriguez, I need your team positioned for containment, but not visible intervention. This needs to appear like a standard robbery response until I can assess their capabilities and intentions. Detective Patterson, who had been quietly observing Maya's transformation throughout the afternoon, finally understood what real tactical competence looked like when it was applied by someone with extensive field experience. Agent Chun, what do you need from local law enforcement? How can we support the operation without compromising your positioning? Maya's smile was sharp and professional, the expression of someone who had coordinated multi-agency responses under combat conditions. Detective Patterson, I need you and your officers to respond exactly as you normally would to an armed robbery call. Enter through the front door, establish positions according to your standard protocols, and follow my lead when the situation develops beyond conventional parameters. The dark sedan completed its reconnaissance circuit and pulled into a parking space near the restaurant's main entrance. 3 figures emerged from the vehicle, their movements controlled and purposeful as they approached the building. Maya could see the outlines of automatic weapons beneath their loose clothing, body armor that suggested extensive preparation, and communication equipment that indicated coordinated tactical capabilities. All positions, this is Phoenix 7. Maya spoke quietly into her secure radio. Subjects are armed and approaching. Weapons appear to be military-grade automatic rifles. Subjects are wearing body armor, and they're using tactical communication systems. This is not a standard robbery crew. Agent Rodriguez's response carried new urgency as he processed the implications of Maya's assessment. Phoenix 7, are we looking at terrorist activity? Domestic extremists with military training? Maya watched the 3 figures pause outside the restaurant's entrance, their final preparation suggesting extensive operational planning and professional-level coordination. Unknown at this time, but their equipment and methodology exceed typical criminal capabilities. Recommend treating this as potential national security threat until we can determine their actual objectives. The restaurant's front door opened with the small chime that announced every customer's arrival, but the sound seemed ominous now as 3 armed figures entered with the confident stride of people who had never encountered serious resistance to their operations. The lead suspect was a tall man in his 30s with military bearing that suggested extensive combat experience. His companions moved with similar precision, automatically securing sight lines and escape routes while scanning for threats with the systematic awareness of people who understood tactical environments. Nobody move and nobody gets hurt, the lead suspect announced, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. This is a robbery. We want the cash from the registers and the safe. Cooperate and everyone goes home safely tonight. Maya was positioned behind the counter, her posture showing appropriate civilian fear while her mind cataloged every detail of the suspect's equipment, positioning, and behavioral patterns. These weren't ordinary criminals conducting opportunistic robberies. They were professionals executing a carefully planned operation with specific objectives beyond simple theft. The second suspect moved toward the cash register while the third maintained overwatch position near the entrance, their coordination suggesting extensive training and repeated practice. Maya noticed communication devices that allowed silent coordination between team members, equipment that exceeded the capabilities of most professional law enforcement units. Everyone stay calm and keep your hands visible, the lead suspect continued, his automatic rifle held with casual competence. That indicated extensive familiarity with the weapon. We're going to collect what we came for and leave. Nobody needs to be a hero today. Maya began moving toward the cash register with appropriate civilian nervousness, her hands slightly raised to demonstrate compliance while she positioned herself for optimal response when the situation required it. She could feel Agent Rodriguez and his team maintaining overwatch from concealed positions, ready to respond if the situation escalated beyond her ability to control. Detective Patterson entered through the front door exactly 3 minutes after the robbery began, his service weapon drawn and his approach following standard protocols that would have been appropriate for conventional criminals, but were completely inadequate for the professionals he was actually facing. "Police, drop your weapons and get on the ground," Detective Patterson shouted, apparently unaware that he was engaging suspects whose tactical capabilities exceeded his own by several orders of magnitude. The lead suspect's response was immediate and devastating. Instead of panicking or attempting to flee, he smoothly transitioned into a defensive position that demonstrated extensive tactical training while maintaining complete control of the situation. "Officer, I appreciate your dedication to duty, but you're outgunned and outmanned," the suspect said calmly, his automatic rifle now trained on Detective Patterson with steady precision. "I suggest you reconsider your approach before this situation becomes more complicated than necessary." Maya realized that the robbery was secondary to whatever these suspects were actually trying to accomplish. Their equipment, training, and response to law enforcement intervention suggested objectives that extended far beyond simple theft. She needed to assess their true intentions before the situation escalated into a firefight that would result in civilian casualties. "Sir, please don't hurt anyone," Maya said, allowing her voice to carry appropriate civilian fear while moving closer to optimal positioning. "We'll give you whatever you want. Nobody here wants any trouble." The lead suspect's attention focused on Maya for the first time, his trained eyes automatically assessing her threat level and finding nothing that suggested danger from a terrified waitress. "That's exactly the right attitude, miss. Smart civilians make everyone's job easier." But the second suspect, who had been monitoring police radio frequencies through sophisticated equipment, suddenly became agitated as he processed information that changed the operational environment. "Marcus, we have a problem," the second suspect said urgently. "Police communications are referencing federal involvement and tactical support units. This isn't the simple local response we planned for." The lead suspect's expression shifted from confident control to concerned assessment as he realized their intelligence about local law enforcement capabilities had been incomplete or deliberately misleading. "Federal involvement means someone knew we were coming," Marcus said, his tactical awareness immediately recognizing the implications. "This location was either under surveillance or we've been compromised." Maya felt the situation reaching the critical point where her intervention would become necessary. The suspects were professional enough to recognize that their operation had been compromised, which meant they would either attempt immediate withdrawal or escalate to hostage scenarios. That would result in civilian casualties. Marcus, I'm detecting multiple tactical radio signatures around the building perimeter. The third suspect reported from his position near the entrance. We're looking at significant law enforcement presence, possibly federal response teams. Detective Patterson, who was still positioned near the front door with his service weapon drawn, made the tactical error that Maya had been hoping to prevent. You're surrounded. There's no way out of this situation. Surrender now and nobody gets hurt. Marcus's response demonstrated exactly why Detective Patterson's confrontational approach was inappropriate for dealing with professional criminals who possessed superior firepower and tactical training. Officer, your negotiation strategy needs work, Marcus said calmly while signaling his team to transition into defensive positions. We're not surrender before we complete our mission here. And if federal agents are positioned around this building, then our operational parameters have changed significantly. Maya realized that the suspect's true objective wasn't robbery, but intelligence gathering, possibly targeting federal operations or attempting to identify undercover agents. Her cover had been compromised not by the robbery itself, but by the federal response that revealed her true identity to anyone monitoring. Law enforcement communications. Marcus, the waitress, the second suspect said suddenly, his voice carrying new urgency. She's been moving into tactical position since we entered. Watch her hands, her positioning, her breathing patterns. That's not civilian behavior. Maya felt her carefully maintained cover dissolving as professional criminals, recognized the subtle signs of tactical training that ordinary people would never notice. Her unconscious positioning had betrayed her too. Observers who possess the expertise to identify threats that conventional law enforcement would miss. Agent Maya Shen, I presume, Marcus said, his weapon now trained directly on her with the steady precision of someone who had faced federal agents before. Phoenix 7, according to our intelligence files. Your reputation precedes you, Agent Chun. The revelation that the suspects knew her identity and call sign confirmed Maya's assessment that this operation extended far beyond simple robbery. These were intelligence operatives conducting targeted surveillance against federal assets, using the robbery as cover for identifying and potentially eliminating undercover agents. Gentlemen, you've done your homework, Maya said, her voice shifting from civilian fear to professional acknowledgement. But if you know who I am, then you also know what I'm capable of accomplishing when civilians are threatened. Marcus's smile was cold and professional, the expression of someone who had studied Maya's operational history and believed he understood her capabilities and limitations. Agent Chen, we've analyzed your previous operations extensively. Your reputation for tactical innovation is impressive, but you're currently outnumbered 3-1 by opponents who match your training and exceed your firepower. The smart play here is negotiation rather than confrontation. Maya's response was delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds before and survived through superior capability rather than favorable circumstances. Marcus, there are 3 things you should understand about tactical analysis. First, numerical superiority is meaningless when you don't control the environment. Second, superior firepower is useless when you can't identify your actual opponents. And third, reputation is just other people's opinions about what you've already accomplished. As Maya spoke, her positioning shifted almost imperceptibly, her body language transforming from civilian compliance to tactical readiness in ways that trained observers would recognize as preparation for immediate action. Agent Chun, I respect your confidence, but the mathematics here are straightforward, Marcus replied, apparently unaware that Maya was no longer in the same position she had occupied when the conversation began. 3 automatic weapons against 1 federal agent with a service pistol, multiple hostages who limit your response options, and backup that can't intervene without risking civilian casualties. Maya's smile was sharp and deadly, the expression of someone who had spent years developing capabilities that exceeded conventional tactical analysis. Marcus, your mathematical assessment assumes that I'm the only federal agent in this room. It assumes that I'm limited to conventional weapons and standard tactical responses. And it assumes that my backup is positioned outside the building rather than integrated into the operational environment. The revelation that Maya might not be working alone caused visible concern among the three suspects, their confident control beginning to crack as they realized their intelligence might have been incomplete or deliberately misleading. Agent Chun, we've accounted for local law enforcement and standard federal response protocols, the second suspect said, his voice carrying new uncertainty. There are no other federal agents in this location. Maya's laugh was soft and dangerous, carrying the confidence of someone who understood the situation better than her opponents could imagine. Gentlemen, Agent Rodriguez has been sitting in booth 7 for the past 2 hours. Agent Martinez has been reading a newspaper at the counter since 5 o'clock, and Agent Thompson has been washing dishes in the kitchen since my shift began this morning. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. 3 seemingly ordinary customers and 1 kitchen worker simultaneously revealed themselves as federal agents, their civilian disguises abandoned as they drew weapons and assumed tactical positions that surrounded the robbery crew with overwhelming firepower and superior positioning. Marcus realized his team had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap, their intelligence operations compromised by federal surveillance that exceeded their detection capabilities. What they had believed was a simple robbery target had actually been a federal safe house designed to identify and capture intelligence operatives who posed threats to national security. Agent Chun, this is entrapment, Marcus said desperately, his tactical confidence evaporating as he faced the reality of professional-level federal response capabilities. Maya's response was delivered with the cold professionalism of someone who had coordinated similar operations across multiple jurisdictions and international boundaries. Marcus, this is consequences. When intelligence operatives target federal assets, they discover that some people fight back with capabilities that exceed their analytical frameworks. The tactical situation had shifted completely in Maya's favor, but she maintained her focus on minimizing civilian casualties while securing the suspects for interrogation. The robbery crew possessed information about intelligence operations that threatened national security, making their capture more important than simple law enforcement. All subjects, drop your weapons and assume prone positions immediately, Agent Rodriguez commanded, his tactical team having achieved perfect positioning while the suspects were focused on Maya's misdirection. Marcus made one final attempt to regain control of the situation, his automatic rifle swinging toward the nearest civilian customers in a desperate hostage gambit. That revealed the true extent of his tactical desperation. Maya's response was faster than conscious thought, her training taking over as she neutralized the threat to innocent people with movements that seemed to violate several laws of physics. In the space between heartbeats, she had disarmed Marcus, secured his weapon, and positioned herself between the other suspects and potential civilian targets. The remaining 2 suspects surrendered immediately, their professional assessment, recognizing that further resistance would be both futile and ultimately fatal. They had encountered capabilities that exceeded their own training and experience, implemented by someone whose operational history they had studied, but failed to fully comprehend. Subject secured, no civilian casualties, situation contained. Agent Rodriguez reported into his tactical radio, while his team processed the suspects for transportation to federal detention facilities. Maya stood in the center of Rosie's roadhouse, surrounded by overturned tables and scattered evidence of the confrontation that had lasted less than 5 minutes but felt like hours to everyone involved. Her transformation from invisible waitress to federal agent was complete, her capabilities revealed in ways that would change everything about how these people understood her identity. Detective Patterson approached Maya with the humble demeanor of someone who finally understood the magnitude of his earlier mistakes. His treatment of her now revealed as harassment of a federal agent whose accomplishments exceeded anything in his professional experience. Agent Chun, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express, Detective Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything I said, everything I did, I was completely wrong about who you are and what you're capable of accomplishing. Maya's response was delivered with the gracious professionalism that had characterized her behavior even during the worst of Detective Patterson's systematic cruelty. Detective Patterson, respect isn't earned through titles or recognition. It's earned through actions, through competence, through caring more about protecting innocent people than advancing personal agendas. She looked around at the assembled law enforcement personnel, who had witnessed capabilities that redefined their understanding of tactical response and federal operations. Today you learned that expertise comes from experience rather than assumptions, that heroes don't announce themselves with fanfare and publicity, and that the quiet person serving your coffee might possess capabilities that could save your life when circumstances require it. Officer Santos, who had observed Maya's complete transformation with fascination and growing respect, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Agent Chun, what happens now? Do you return to federal operations, or do you continue working? Here is Maya the waitress. Maya's smile was gentle and knowing, the expression of someone who understood that some questions couldn't be answered with simple explanations. Officer Santos, federal agents don't retire from service. We just change assignments and adapt to new operational requirements. She moved toward the restaurant's front door, pausing to survey the damage from the confrontation and ensuring that civilian customers were receiving appropriate support from paramedical personnel. My assignment here was to identify and neutralize intelligence threats against federal operations. That mission is now complete, but new assignments require different capabilities and cover identities. Agent Rodriguez approached Maya with the respectful demeanor of someone who had coordinated operations with legendary federal agents, but had never worked directly with someone of her reputation and capabilities. Agent Chun, Washington wants a complete debriefing on the intelligence network these suspects represent. Your infiltration work has identified a significant threat to national security that extends far beyond local criminal activity. Maya nodded, her acknowledgement while removing the Rosie's Roadhouse name tag that had been her identity for 2 years. The small plastic rectangle representing a cover story that had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. Agent Rodriguez, the debriefing will reveal that some threats require long-term surveillance and patient intelligence gathering rather than immediate tactical response. Sometimes the most effective way to identify your enemies is to let them think they're hunting you. As Maya walked toward the federal vehicles that would transport her to the next phase of her career, Detective Patterson called out one final question that carried the weight of everything he had learned about assumptions, respect, and the extraordinary people who sometimes hide in ordinary places. Agent Chun, how do we know when we're in the presence of someone whose capabilities exceed our understanding? How do we avoid making the same mistakes I made with you? Maya turned back with the same gentle smile she had worn while enduring months of systematic humiliation and professional disrespect, her response carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that true strength often comes from allowing others to underestimate you completely. Detective Patterson, you treat every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent position or background. You listen more than you speak, observe more than you assume, and remember that courage and capability come in forms you might never recognize, until the moment when those qualities become absolutely necessary. Maya climbed into the federal vehicle that would carry her away from Rosie's Roadhouse, and toward whatever assignment required her particular combination of skills and experience. She left behind only the memory of capabilities that had seemed impossible until they became absolutely necessary for protecting innocent people from threats they never knew existed. 6 months later, Detective Patterson was conducting a training session for junior officers about the importance of treating all citizens with respect and professionalism. He often told the story of the waitress who had saved their lives while teaching him the most important lesson of his law enforcement career. Officer Santos had been promoted to detective and now specialized in federal liaison operations. Her experience with Agent Chun, having demonstrated the importance of multi-jurisdictional cooperation and mutual respect between different levels of law enforcement. Rosie's Roadhouse continued normal operations under new management, its reputation enhanced by word-of-mouth stories about the day when federal agents had prevented a terrorist attack while maintaining perfect cover as ordinary customers and staff members. And somewhere in another small town, in another unremarkable location, Maya Chen was beginning a new assignment that required different capabilities and a new cover identity. Because true heroes don't seek recognition or retire from service. They just show up when the world needs saving, complete their missions with professional competence, and disappear back into ordinary life until duty calls again. The storm that Detective Patterson had created with his systematic cruelty had encountered a force of nature he couldn't comprehend, and the collision had revealed truths about capability, respect, and heroism that would influence his approach to law enforcement for the rest of his career. Because some people's true capabilities remain hidden until the moment when revealing them becomes the only way to protect innocent lives from threats that conventional thinking isn't equipped to handle. And sometimes the most important lessons come from discovering that the person you've been underestimating possesses forgotten accomplishments that exceed your wildest professional aspirations. Maya Chun, whatever her current name and assignment, was out there somewhere, serving coffee or working retail or doing whatever ordinary job provided the perfect cover for extraordinary capabilities that the world needed but would never publicly acknowledge. Ready to save lives, protect innocent people, and remind everyone who encountered her that heroes don't always announce themselves with medals and recognition. Sometimes they just appear when you need them most, accomplish impossible things with quiet competence, and return to invisible life until the next time extraordinary capabilities become absolutely necessary for keeping the world safe from threats that most people never know existed. 5 years had passed since the incident at Rosie's Roadhouse, and Detective Patterson found himself standing in the parking lot of Murphy's Cafe, a small establishment just outside Phoenix where he'd been called to investigate reports of suspicious activity. The years had changed him profoundly, transforming his approach to law enforcement and his understanding of what true professionalism meant. The call had come from the cafe's owner, who reported seeing the same group of men conducting surveillance for 3 consecutive days. They parked across the street in different vehicles, always at the same time, always watching the restaurant with equipment that seemed more sophisticated than typical criminal reconnaissance. Patterson entered the cafe with the careful observation skills he'd developed since learning that appearances could be devastatingly misleading. The establishment was busier than expected for a Tuesday afternoon, filled with the usual mix of travelers, local workers, and retirees who treated small-town cafes as community centers. Behind the counter, a woman in her early 30s moved with efficient grace, taking orders and serving customers with the kind of professional competence that suggested years of experience in food service. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her uniform bore a simple name tag reading Sarah. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything beyond dedicated restaurant work. But Patterson had learned to look beyond surfaces, to notice details that might reveal deeper truths about the people he encountered. Sarah's movements showed unusual spatial awareness, her eyes automatically tracking everyone who entered or left the establishment. When she carried multiple plates, her balance was perfect even when navigating around obstacles, suggesting physical conditioning that exceeded normal requirements for restaurant work. Coffee? Sarah asked as Patterson settled into a corner booth that offered clear sight lines to both entrances. "Please." "And I'm Detective Patterson, Flagstaff Police. The owner called about some surveillance activity in the area. Have you noticed anything unusual over the past few days?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Patterson caught a flicker of something in her eyes that suggested the question had triggered professional rather than civilian concern. "There have been some men watching the place," she said carefully. "Same pattern each day, different vehicles, but always positioned where they can observe customer traffic and staff schedules." Patterson noted that Sarah's assessment included details that ordinary witnesses rarely noticed. Customer traffic patterns and staff schedules weren't typical concerns for restaurant workers unless they'd been trained to recognize surveillance activities. "Did you happen to notice anything about their equipment or behavior that stood out?" Sarah paused in her coffee service, her trained eyes focusing on Patterson with the kind of assessment that suggested she was evaluating his competence rather than simply answering questions. "Detective Patterson, those men are using thermal imaging equipment, directional microphones, and communication systems that exceed typical private investigation capabilities. Their observation patterns suggest military or federal training." The casual precision with which Sarah identified sophisticated surveillance equipment sent familiar chills down Patterson's spine. He'd heard similar assessments before, from someone whose true capabilities had remained hidden until circumstances forced their revelation. "Ma'am, that's very specific technical knowledge for someone working in food service. Have you had experience with surveillance equipment?" Sarah's smile was gentle but knowing, the expression of someone who understood far more about the situation than her role suggested. "Detective, some experiences stay with you regardless of your current circumstances, and some skills remain useful even when you're hoping never to need them again." Patterson felt pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to align in his mind. The same sensation he'd experienced years earlier when discovering that assumptions about people's capabilities could prove spectacularly wrong. "Sarah, I have to ask this directly. Are you currently or have you previously been involved in law enforcement or federal operations?" Instead of answering immediately, Sarah glanced toward the front window where one of the surveillance vehicles had just pulled into the parking lot. 3 men emerged with the controlled movements of people conducting a planned operation, their positioning automatic and professional as they approached the cafe's entrance. "Detective Patterson, you're about to witness why some people choose quiet lives in small towns, and why that choice doesn't necessarily mean they've forgotten how to protect themselves and others when circumstances require it." The 3 men entered Murphy's Cafe with confidence that suggested they'd never encountered serious resistance to their operations. They were well-dressed, professional in appearance, but Patterson's trained eye caught details that suggested concealed weapons and tactical awareness that exceeded normal business or investigative activities. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're conducting a federal investigation," the lead man announced, displaying credentials that looked official but triggered Patterson's instincts about document authenticity. "We need everyone to remain calm while we execute a search warrant for this establishment." Sarah continued serving customers with the same efficient grace, but Patterson noticed subtle changes in her positioning that suggested preparation for immediate action. She'd moved closer to potential cover positions while maintaining clear sight lines to all 3 suspects. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Patterson said, rising from his booth and displaying his badge. "Detective Patterson, Flagstaff Police. Could I see that warrant and verify your credentials through proper channels?" The lead suspect's response revealed the true nature of their operation as his professional demeanor cracked under legitimate law enforcement scrutiny. "Detective, this is a federal matter that exceeds local jurisdiction. We don't require verification through local channels." Patterson's years of experience since the Rosie's incident had taught him to recognize evasion and false authority when he encountered it. These men weren't federal agents conducting legitimate operations. They were criminals using official pretense to gain access to their target. Sir, all federal operations in this jurisdiction require coordination with local law enforcement. If you're unwilling to verify your credentials, I'm going to have to ask you to leave while I confirm your authority through appropriate channels. The situation escalated rapidly as the three suspects realized their cover story had been compromised by someone who understood proper law enforcement protocols. Instead of withdrawing or providing legitimate verification, they shifted into aggressive postures that revealed their true intentions. Detective, you're interfering with a classified operation, the second suspect said, his hand moving toward a concealed weapon with practiced ease. I suggest you reconsider your position before this situation becomes more complicated than necessary. Sarah had been watching the confrontation develop while continuing her restaurant duties, but Patterson caught her subtle signal toward the kitchen area where other staff members had taken cover. Her movement suggested someone coordinating defensive positions rather than simply seeking safety. Gentlemen, you've made several tactical errors, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying new authority that made everyone in the cafe stop what they were doing. First, you failed to properly identify law enforcement presence before initiating your operation. Second, you assumed that rural establishments wouldn't have adequate security measures. And third, you walked into a location that's under federal protection without understanding what that protection entails. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah's posture straightened, her voice carried command authority, and her positioning had shifted to tactical advantage without anyone noticing the movement. Ma'am, you need to stay out of this situation, the lead suspect said, his attention dividing dangerously between Patterson and Sarah as he realized the operational environment had become more complex than anticipated. Sarah's response was delivered with calm professionalism that made Patterson's blood run cold with recognition and anticipation. Gentlemen, my name is Agent Sarah Mitchell, and this establishment is a federal safe house under active protection. Your surveillance activities have been monitored, your identities have been confirmed, and your criminal backgrounds have been thoroughly investigated. The revelation that they'd walked into a federal operation caused visible panic among the three suspects, their confident control evaporating as they faced the reality of professional law enforcement response capabilities. Agent Mitchell, we have legitimate business here, the second suspect said desperately, his earlier aggression replaced by obvious concern as he realized their operation had been compromised from the beginning. Sarah's laugh was soft and deadly, carrying the confidence of someone who had orchestrated similar operations across multiple jurisdictions. Your legitimate business consists of identity theft, credit card fraud, and targeting small businesses for financial crimes using false federal credentials. We've been tracking your activities for 6 months. Patterson watched in fascination as Sarah revealed capabilities that exceeded anything he could have imagined. Her transformation from restaurant worker to federal agent, demonstrating the same pattern he'd witnessed years earlier with Agent Chun. The tactical situation shifted completely in Sarah's favor as additional agents emerged from concealed positions throughout the cafe, their civilian disguises abandoned as they surrounded the criminal suspects with overwhelming firepower and superior positioning. All subjects, drop any weapons and assume prone positions immediately, Agent Martinez commanded, having revealed himself as the customer who'd been reading a newspaper at the counter for the past hour. The three suspects surrendered without resistance, their professional assessment recognizing that further confrontation would be both futile and potentially fatal. They had encountered federal capabilities that exceeded their criminal planning and tactical preparation. Subjects secured, no civilian casualties, operation successful. Agent Rodriguez reported from his position near the kitchen entrance, where he'd been posing as a maintenance worker for the past week. Patterson stood in the center of Murphy's Cafe, surrounded by evidence of a federal operation that had been invisible until the moment when it became necessary to reveal itself. His understanding of rural law enforcement had been expanded once again by encountering capabilities that redefined his assumptions about small-town establishments and their staff. "Agent Mitchell, I have to ask," Patterson said, his voice carrying the humble respect he'd learned to show toward federal agents whose accomplishments exceeded his professional experience. "How long have you been operating this safe house?" Sarah's smile was gentle and knowing, the expression of someone who understood that some questions required careful answers. "Detective Patterson, federal safe houses operate on extended timelines that allow for comprehensive intelligence gathering and threat assessment. Sometimes the most effective way to identify criminal networks is to let them think they're hunting you while you're actually studying them." She moved toward the front window, where federal vehicles were arriving to transport the suspects to detention facilities for interrogation about their broader criminal activities. This operation identified a network of criminals targeting rural businesses across 4 states, using false federal credentials to gain access and conduct financial crimes. Your proper verification procedures prevented them from completing their mission here. Patterson felt a surge of professional pride at having contributed meaningfully to a federal operation, his insistence on proper protocols having helped expose criminals who might otherwise have succeeded in their fraudulent activities. "Agent Mitchell, what happens to Murphy's Cafe now? Do you continue the safe house operation, or does this location get shut down?" Sarah's response carried the same wisdom that Agent Chun had demonstrated years earlier about the nature of federal service and the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others. "Detective Patterson, federal agents don't retire from protecting people. We just adapt to new assignments and different operational requirements." She removed the Murphy's Cafe name tag that had been her cover identity, the small plastic rectangle representing another successful deep cover operation that had served its purpose. "My next assignment requires different capabilities and a new cover story, but there will always be federal agents in positions where they can identify and neutralize threats to public safety." As Sarah walked toward the federal vehicles that would transport her to debriefing and her next assignment, Patterson called out one final question that carried everything he'd learned about respect, capability, and the extraordinary people who dedicate their lives to protecting others. "Agent Mitchell, thank you for your service. And thank you for reminding me that heroes work in every profession, protecting people who never know they need protection." Sarah turned back with the same gentle smile she'd worn while serving coffee to people who had no idea they were being protected by someone whose capabilities exceeded their wildest imagination. "Detective Patterson, the greatest honor in law enforcement is protecting people who never know they were in danger. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that nobody ever hears about." Sarah climbed into the federal vehicle that would carry her away from Murphy's Cafe and toward whatever assignment required her particular combination of skills and experience, leaving behind only the memory of professional competence and quiet heroism that had prevented criminal activity while maintaining perfect operational security. Patterson remained in the empty cafe, processing everything he'd witnessed and learned about federal operations, professional competence, and the extraordinary people who choose to dedicate their lives to protecting others without seeking recognition or public acknowledgement. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Detective Patterson, there are heroes in every small town, working in every ordinary job, ready to protect people when circumstances require it. Keep your eyes open and your assumptions flexible. The world is safer because of people like you who understand that respect and professionalism matter more than titles or recognition." Patterson smiled as he realized that Agent Chun was still out there somewhere, still watching over people and still teaching lessons about capability, respect, and the importance of never underestimating anyone based on their apparent position or background. He left Murphy's Cafe with renewed appreciation for the complexity of federal operations and the dedication of agents who spent years in deep cover, protecting communities that never knew they needed protection from threats they never knew existed. Because some heroes wear uniforms and carry badges, while others serve coffee and take orders, but all of them share the commitment to protecting innocent people from dangers that most people never realize are lurking in the shadows of ordinary life. The legacy of Agent Chun lived on in every interaction Patterson had with people whose capabilities might exceed his understanding, and in his commitment to treating everyone with the respect and professionalism that true heroes deserve, regardless of whether their heroism is visible or hidden behind the cover of ordinary work. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.